The silence was louder than the war drums. Cecilia stood on the precipice of the great altar, her heart beating a rhythm Gengler used to call his favorite song. But tonight, the Alpha King wasn't listening. His hands were anchored firmly to the waist of Hazel, the woman whose high-born laugh sounded like silver bells and whose lineage promised a stronger throne. Every eye in the kingdom of Blackmore was fixed on them. Cecilia felt the air thin as Gengler leaned in. He didn't just break a promise, he severed a soul. As his fangs sank into Hazel's neck to seal the lunar mark, the sacred bond between Gengler and Cecilia didn't just fade, it snapped. "I cannot rule with a shadow," Gengler's voice boomed, amplified by his alpha status. "A queen must speak. A queen must command. Cecilia is nothing but a beautiful void. I reject you." The rejection hit Cecilia's chest like a physical blade. She opened her mouth to scream, to beg, but only a puff of cold air escaped. Her voice was gone. But as her physical voice died, an ancient frequency exploded outward. She didn't make a sound, yet the massive palace windows shattered simultaneously. The Alpha King stumbled back, and the three rival kings Ashfong, Howard, and Gerald all stood at once. Before we continue, please click the subscribe button, drop a comment, like, and share. Your support helps more than you know. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get back to the story. The glass lay in ruins at her feet, mirroring her heart, but as Cecilia looked at Gengler through the shards, her eyes weren't filled with the tears he expected. They were glowing with a terrifying, golden light. The ringing of shattered glass was the only sound in the great hall. Gengler stood frozen, his fangs still wet with Hazel's blood, his eyes wide as he stared at the woman he had just called a void. The golden glow in Cecilia's eyes wasn't just light, it was a physical weight that made the air hum with a low, dangerous frequency. The silence didn't last. From the front row of the visiting dignitaries, three men rose with a synchronized precision that made the Blackmore guards reach for their hilts. They didn't move like guests, they moved like predators who had just found the prize of a lifetime. Ashfong, the alpha of the Iron Tundra, stepped forward first. He was a mountain of a man, his armor scarred by 100 wars, his presence a wall of raw, territorial heat. He didn't look at Gengler. He looked at Cecilia, his wolf moving beneath his skin with visible agitation. "You call her silent?" Ashfong's voice grated like stones in a river. "My wolf is howling just looking at her. She isn't empty, Gengler. She's a storm you weren't strong enough to weather." To Cecilia's left, Howard, the alpha strategist of the Gilded Coast, adjusted the cuff of his tailored silk sleeve. His eyes were analytical, tracking the way the golden resonance still vibrated in the air. "A tactical error, King Gengler," Howard remarked, his tone deceptively conversational. "To discard the only wolf capable of a sonic nova over a woman who simply sings well? It's a waste of resources I cannot ignore." Then there was Gerald. The alpha of the Shadow Veil moved like smoke, his voice a velvet caress that seemed to vibrate against Cecilia's skin. He ignored the guards entirely, stepping over the glass shards until he was only 3 paces from Cecilia. "You lost your voice, little bird?" he whispered, his eyes dark with a mix of charm and lethal intent. "But the world was too loud for you anyway. Let us provide the silence you deserve." Gengler's dominance flared, his face contorting in fury. "She is my subject. Rejected or not, she stays within Blackmore's walls." Ashfong laughed, a sound like a low growl. "She is a free agent the moment that bond snapped. And we aren't here to negotiate." The 3 alphas fanned out, forming a protective perimeter around Cecilia that excluded her former mate entirely. It was a declaration of war disguised as an invitation. Gerald bowed, extending a hand clad in dark leather. "Blackmore is a cage of echoes, Cecilia. Come with us to the valleys. We don't want you to speak. We want you to reign. Cecilia looked from the hand to Gengler's trembling rage. She didn't have a voice to answer, but she didn't need one. She stepped over the shattered glass toward the three kings, her silence becoming the most powerful command in the room. The following week, the atmosphere in the capital was thick with a different kind of tension, not the violent shock of the rejection, but the sharp, biting edge of a royal scandal. Despite the three alphas standing by her, Cecilia had not yet left the palace. Instead, she had been moved to the silent wing, a move orchestrated by Howard to ensure the public saw her as a dignified guest rather than a fleeing victim. The victory gala for the new lunar was supposed to be Hazel's ultimate triumph. The ballroom was a sea of shimmering silks and predatory smiles. Hazel stood at Gengler's side, draped in gold lace that practically glowed under the chandeliers. She was holding court, her laugh tinkling through the room like a perfectly tuned instrument. Gengler, however, looked like a man haunted. His eyes kept darting to the entrance, his alpha aura flickering with an uncharacteristic instability. When Cecilia finally entered, the music didn't stop, but the breathing did. She was flanked by Ashfong and Gerald, walking with a grace that made the marble floor seem to bow beneath her. She wore a dress of midnight velvet, her throat bare of any mate mark, her eyes calm and observant. Hazel's smile tightened. She stepped forward, her voice amplified by the room's acoustics. Cecilia, how brave of you to join us. We were just discussing the duties of a queen. It must be so peaceful, not having to worry about diplomatic speeches or commanding the guard. A ripple of cruel laughter followed. Hazel leaned in, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that everyone could still hear. Tell me, does it hurt? To be so beautiful and yet so broken? Gengler needs a voice that can rouse an army, not a pet who can only break windows when she's upset. Cecilia didn't flinch. She simply looked at Hazel, really looked at her. As Hazel continued to mock her, her voice began to sound increasingly melodic, almost unnaturally sweet. Cecilia felt a vibration in the air, the same one she'd sensed at the altar. It was a frequency of deception. Cecilia closed her eyes. She didn't scream. She didn't even open her mouth. Instead, she focused on a single low-frequency hum in her chest, a resonance of truth. The air in the ballroom suddenly felt heavy, like the moments before a lightning strike. A low, vibrating pulse rippled out from Cecilia. It hit Hazel squarely in the chest. The effect was instantaneous. Hazel's silver bell voice cracked. The beautiful, melodic tone vanished, replaced by a harsh, grating screech. The vocal glamour she had been using to enchant the court and Gengler shattered like glass. I meant to say, Hazel's true voice sounded like rusted metal grinding together. It was thin, desperate, and filled with a hidden malice. The ballroom went deathly quiet. Howard stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he adjusted his spectacles. That's a fascinating tone, Lady Hazel. I've only heard that particular pitch in siren wolves who use vocal magic to mimic fated bonds. Tell me, is your voice the only thing about you that's a lie? Gengler recoiled from Hazel as if she had turned into a viper. The suspicion in the room was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. Cecilia simply inclined her head, her golden eyes meeting Gengler's. For the first time, he saw the depth of the mistake he had made. He had traded a silent soul for a loud deception. The aftermath of the gala left a heavy, suspicious silence over the palace. While the three rival alphas fortified the guest wing, Cecilia stood by the window, watching the moonlight bleed across the training grounds. She didn't hear the door open. She felt the shift in the air, the scent of cold iron and old parchment. Quiraz, Gengler's most loyal enforcer, stepped out of the shadows. He didn't bow as a subordinate. He inclined his head as a man carrying a burden too heavy for his king. The gala wasn't just a scandal, Cecilia, Quiroz said, his voice a low gravel. It was a failure of the council's control. Cecilia turned, her golden eyes questioning. Quiroz stepped closer, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade, his eyes darting to the corridor. Gengler isn't himself. Since the night of the blood moon, the High Council has been spiking his tonic with a refined extract of silver root. It doesn't just dull the wolf, it erodes the mind, making the host suggestible. Why do you think a man who trembled when he touched you 3 nights ago suddenly found the strength to reject you for a siren like Hazel? Cecilia's heart hammered against her ribs. Revenge was a simmering coal in her gut. Part of her wanted to watch Gengler's kingdom crumble as he lost his mind to the very men he trusted. If he was drugged, he was a fool. If he was a fool, he deserved the fall. They are using his instability to pass the New Order Act, Quiroz continued, his expression grim. Once he signs it tomorrow at dawn, the council gains the power to call any wolf they deem defective. They started with your voice, Cecilia. They'll end with your life. Gengler is the only one with the blood seal to stop them, but by morning he won't even remember your name. The choice hung in the air, thick and suffocating. If she stayed silent, Gengler would become a puppet, Hazel would be his hollow queen, and the council would rule. Cecilia would be free to leave with Ashfong, Howard, or Gerald protected and wealthy, but leaving her people to a tyrant's shadow. If she saved him, she was saving the man who had publicly humiliated her. She was saving the lips that had spoken her rejection. Cecilia walked toward Quiroz. She couldn't speak, but she reached out and gripped his forearm. Her touch was cold, firm, and filled with a resonance that made the captain's breath hitch. She wasn't choosing Gengler. She was choosing the kingdom. She was choosing to prove that the silent saw the truth that the loud were too arrogant to notice. Quiroz nodded, understanding the silent command. The council's chambers are beneath the east tower. The tonic is prepared at midnight. If you can disrupt the frequency of the brewing, you can break the fog in his mind. Cecilia straightened her spine. Her wolf didn't whimper for a lost mate anymore. It snarled for justice. The weight of the palace walls had become suffocating. After her secret meeting with Quiroz, Cecilia felt the ticking clock of the council's conspiracy pressing against her chest. Sensing her restlessness, Ashfong, the warrior alpha of the Iron Tundra, did not offer her platitudes or empty comforts. Instead, he brought her a pair of soft leather hunting leathers and pointed toward the obsidian gates. The moon is high, and the wind is carrying the scent of the northern elk, Ashfong said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to ground her frantic thoughts. In my lands, we believe the heart only speaks when the tongue is still. Come. They ran not as king and guest, but as shadows. The forest outside Blackmore was a cathedral of silver light and deep pine shadows. For the first time since the rejection, Cecilia let her wolf forward. She didn't shift fully, she kept her human form but allowed her senses to sharpen until she could hear the sap frozen inside the trees. Ashfong moved with a brutal, efficient grace beside her. He didn't try to fill the air with small talk or demand her attention. He simply was. When they reached the ridge overlooking the frozen creek, he stopped, signaling her to crouch. A massive stag stood in the clearing, its antlers like a crown of bone. Ashfong didn't look at the prey, he looked at Cecilia. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering near hers. He didn't grab it, he waited. Cecilia slid her hand into his. The moment their skin met, a surge of warmth traveled up her arm. It wasn't the searing, chaotic heat of her bond with Gengler. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse. I hear you, his touch seemed to say. Ashfong leaned closer, his scent of cedar and wood smoke enveloping her. He placed his other hand over her heart, feeling the rapid fire beat against her ribs. He closed his eyes, and Cecilia felt a strange, telepathic resonance, a side effect of her growing, silent power. She didn't hear words, but she felt his admiration. He saw her not as a broken queen, but as a masterpiece of resilience. He picked up a smooth stone from the creek and pressed it into her palm. "The river doesn't need to scream to carve the mountain, Cecilia," he whispered, his lips grazing the shell of her ear. "It just persists. You are the river." In the shared silence of the hunt, Cecilia realized a profound truth. Gengler had used his voice to control her, to define her, and eventually to discard her. But with Ashfong, the absence of speech was a bridge, not a barrier. She felt seen in a way that words had never managed to achieve. As they stood together under the canopy of stars, Cecilia felt her inner power stabilize. She wasn't just a victim of a rejection, she was a force of nature. And as she looked back toward the dark spires of the palace, she knew she was ready to face the council. She had found a different kind of heartbeat, one that didn't require a voice to be heard. The air in the palace had grown thick with the scent of ozone and copper. Following her attempt to disrupt the council's brewing ritual, Cecilia found herself navigating the darkened limestone corridors of the East Tower. But the shadows here didn't just hide bodies, they moved. Before she could reach the safety of the guest wing, a heavy, enchanted shroud fell over her. Her internal resonance spiked, a silent alarm bells ringing in her mind, but a sharp sting at her neck, a dart laced with wolfsbane and silver, sent her world into a spiraling gray. When Cecilia's eyes finally flickered open, she wasn't in a dungeon. She was in the chamber of unified thought. High above, the council members sat in a circle of obsidian chairs, their faces obscured by bone masks. In the center of the room, a massive, vibrating tuning fork hummed with a nauseating rhythmic pulse. "You possess a rare gift, Cecilia," the High Elder's voice echoed, cold and devoid of empathy. A voice that exists outside the standard spectrum. "You are an anomaly, and anomalies are dangerous to a stable state." As the tuning fork's hum intensified, Cecilia felt a terrifying pressure in her skull. She realized this was the groupthink frequency, a psychic broadcast designed to harmonize every wolf's thoughts into a single, obedient drone. The elder gestured to a viewing glass where Gengler stood in the courtyard below, his eyes glassy and vacant, surrounded by advisors all nodding in eerie unison. "Look at your king. He's perfect now. He no longer questions. He no longer doubts. By removing the noise of dissenting voices like yours, we create a kingdom of absolute peace." Cecilia thrashed against her bindings, her golden eyes burning. She realized the educational horror of their plan. The council believed that leadership was about total consensus. They taught that diversity of thought was the friction that caused war. But Cecilia saw the truth in Gengler's empty gaze. Without the friction of different perspectives, a leader doesn't find peace, they find a vacuum. By silencing the low and the different, the council hadn't created a perfect harmony, they had created a hollow echo chamber where no one could see the cliff they were all walking toward. When a leader stops listening to the silent, the marginalized, and the different, the elder whispered, leaning over her, they stop being a leader. They become a tool. And tomorrow, Gengler will use his tool-like hand to sign away the lives of every defective wolf in Blackmoor. The frequency shifted to a piercing, high-pitched whine, intended to shatter Cecilia's unique resonance and fold her into the hive mind. Her vision blurred, the faces of Ashfong, Howard, and Gerald fading from her memory. But as the pressure reached a breaking point, Cecilia didn't try to fight the noise. She leaned into the silence at the center of it. She remembered the lesson. True strength isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about being the one who hears what everyone else is trying to drown out. Deep in her chest, the silent scream, began to coil like a spring. She wasn't just an anomaly. She was the antidote. The morning sun bled through the high windows of the great hall, but for Gengler, the world was a blur of gray fog. He stood at the oak table, the New Order Act spread before him. To his left, Hazel leaned in, her voice still thin and metallic since the gala, whispering encouragement that felt like needles in his mind. "Just a signature, my king," she rasped. "To ensure the strength of Blackmore. To remove the silence that weakens us." Gengler's hand shook as he reached for the pen. But as he looked at the parchment, a sudden, sharp resonance vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't a sound. It was a memory of a frequency, the same one that had shattered the windows the night of the rejection. The groupthink broadcast from the East Tower flickered for a split second, interrupted by the sheer force of Cecilia's internal struggle. In that moment of static, the fog in Gengler's mind cleared. He looked at Hazel, seeing her not as a fated mate, but as a hollow puppet of the council. He looked at the guards, all standing with the same vacant, nodding expressions. Finally, he looked at the empty space beside him where Cecilia should have been. He remembered calling her a void. He remembered saying she had nothing to offer because she couldn't speak. A wave of crushing realization hit him. The void hadn't been Cecilia. It was him. He had been so empty of conviction, so hollowed out by the council's drugs and Hazel's glamour, that he had mistaken his own lack of vision for her lack of voice. He had been the one who was silent in his duty, silent in his protection of the bond, and silent in his soul. "My king," Hazel prompted, her hand touching his arm. Gengler recoiled as if burned. He didn't just drop the pen, he snapped it. The ink splattered across the New Order Act like blood. "Get away from me," Gengler growled, his alpha aura returning with a violent, jagged edge. The drug was still in his system, but the shock of his own shame was acting as a powerful stimulant. "Gengler, you're confused," Hazel began, trying to pitch her voice to that enchanting frequency again. "I have never been clearer," Gengler roared, the sound echoing through the hall and cracking the stone pillars. He grabbed the New Order Act and tore it into shreds. "I called her a shadow because I was afraid of her light. I called her a void because I was too small to fill the space she occupied." He turned to the council advisors, his eyes flashing a predatory crimson. "Where is she? Where is my mate?" At that moment, a distant, muffled boom shook the palace. The silent scream had begun. Cecilia wasn't waiting to be saved. The blast that shook the East Tower wasn't an explosion of gunpowder. It was the sound of a barrier breaking. Gerald and Howard had moved with surgical precision, intercepting the council's transport before Cecilia could be moved to a permanent containment facility. Now, hidden within the reinforced walls of the Gilded Coast's embassy, Cecilia sat in the center of a specialized training chamber. The walls were lined with sound-dampening lead and ancient quartz. "The council thinks your silence is a void they can fill with their own noise," Howard said, pacing the perimeter with a tablet of ancient frequencies in hand. "But they've misunderstood the physics of it. You aren't voiceless, Cecilia. You are a biological capacitor. You've been absorbing the kinetic energy of every insult, every rejection, and every psychic broadcast they've thrown at you." Cecilia looked at her hands. They were trembling, glowing with a faint, rhythmic pulse of amber light. "Don't try to hold it in," Gerald whispered, leaning against a pillar, his eyes dark with fascination. "That's what's killing you. You've spent your whole life trying to be normal, trying to squeeze a scream into a whisper. So, if the world wants to give you its hate, learn to reflect it." Howard adjusted a dial on a sonic resonator. "We're going to teach you to phase. When the groupthink frequency hits you, don't fight the wave. Become the shore. If you can synchronize your internal pulse with their broadcast, You can turn their own weapon into a shield that no wolf, not even Gengler, can penetrate. Think of it as a lesson in boundaries, Gerald added with a sharp, charming smirk. In leadership, if you don't define your own space, others will occupy it for you. Your silence is your boundary. Cecilia closed her eyes. She reached deep into the place where her voice used to live. She found the silent scream, that raw, jagged energy of her rejection, and instead of letting it tear her apart, she began to shape it. As Howard activated the training resonator, a piercing whine filled the room. Cecilia didn't flinch. She breathed out, and a ripple of golden light expanded from her chest, forming a shimmering, translucent dome. The sonic waves hit the shield and simply dissolved. She wasn't just surviving the noise anymore. She was mastering it. "Excellent," Howard murmured. "The sentinel is awake." Cecilia stood up, the golden shield humming around her like a living prayer. She didn't need to speak to tell them she was ready. Her presence alone was a declaration of war. The winter wind howled through the battlements of Blackmoor, but it was nothing compared to the storm brewing in the courtyard. The council, sensing their grip on the kingdom slipping as Gengler regained his senses, issued a final, desperate ultimatum. The decree was delivered by a silver-masked messenger. Cecilia was to be exiled to the Dead Lands for her unnatural interference, and Gengler was to submit to a cleansing of the mind, to restore his loyalty to the council's consensus. Gengler didn't even read the full scroll. He shredded it with a single swipe of his claws, his eyes burning with a clarity that had been missing for weeks. "Tell the council," he growled, his voice vibrating with alpha authority, "that I am no longer their puppet, and the woman they call defective is the only one fit to lead this pack." But the council had anticipated his defiance. Before the message could even reach the East Tower, the groupthink frequency hit the palace with the force of a tidal wave. This time, it wasn't a subtle hum, it was a weaponized shriek designed to paralyze anyone with a wolf's soul. Guards dropped to their knees, clutching their heads as the forced mental harmony tried to overwrite their individual wills. "Now!" Howard shouted from the balcony of the guest wing. Cecilia stepped forward. She didn't have a sword, and she didn't have a voice, but she had the silent shield. She expanded her amber resonance, creating a safe harbor around Ashfong and Gerald. Within the bubble of her power, the three alphas were immune to the council's frequency. "Strike the center," Cecilia signaled through a sharp, telepathic pulse that Howard had helped her refine. The counterattack was a masterpiece of coordinated chaos. Ashfong led the front line, his raw warrior strength smashing through the council's magically enhanced enforcers. Gerald moved through the shadows, a blur of lethal charm that neutralized the snipers on the roof before they could even aim. Howard directed the flow of the battle, using his strategic genius to trap the council's loyalists in the very corridors they had used to abduct Cecilia. Gengler fought like a man possessed, clearing a path toward the council chambers. He wasn't fighting for his throne anymore. He was fighting for the right to stand beside the woman he had wronged. The rebellion wasn't just crushed, it was dismantled. One by one, the council members were forced out of their obsidian chairs, their masks shattered, their unified thought broken by the sheer diversity of the attack. As the dust settled, the palace fell into a true, natural silence. The groupthink was dead. Gengler stood in the center of the hall, covered in the soot of battle, and turned toward Cecilia. For the first time, he didn't look at her with pity or arrogance. He looked at her with awe. He dropped to one knee not as a king surrendering a crown, but as a man acknowledging his superior. The council's defeat left a vacuum of power that smelled of ozone and shattered vanity. In the center of the wreckage stood Hazel, her gold lace gown torn and her face contorted in a mask of pure, ugly desperation. She wasn't looking at the fallen council. She was looking at the way Gengler watched Cecilia with a reverence that she had never been able to manufacture. "This is a mistake." Hazel's voice was no longer a silver bell. It was a jagged, desperate rasp. She lunged toward Gengler, her fingers like claws. "I am your chosen lunar. You marked me. The bond is sealed." Gengler didn't even flinch. He looked down at the mark on Hazel's neck, the mark he had given her while under the fog of the groupthink frequency. With a low growl, he stepped back. "A mark made in a fever is not a bond, Hazel. It's a scar. And I will not let a scar define the future of Blackmore." Howard stepped forward, his eyes cold and analytical as he adjusted his glasses. "The false lunar protocol," he whispered, loud enough for the gathering court to hear. "According to ancient law, a mate mark obtained through vocal glamour or psychic coercion is null and void. It isn't just a scandal, Hazel. It's treason." Hazel looked around the room, searching for an ally, but she found none. The three rival alphas, Ashfong, Howard, and Gerald, stood like pillars of judgment. Even Quiraz stood with his hand on his sword, his loyalty finally returned to a king who could see the truth. "You think she's better?" Hazel shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Cecilia. "She can't even tell you she loves you. She's a broken tool, Gengler. You're trading a queen for a statue." Cecilia didn't need to speak. She walked toward Hazel, the golden resonance in her eyes glowing with a calm, terrifying intensity. As she drew near, she released a focused pulse of her silent scream. It wasn't violent, but it was heavy, a physical weight of truth that forced Hazel to her knees. In that silence, the court saw the contrast. Hazel, loud and hollow. Cecilia, silent and substantial. "Take her," Gengler commanded, his voice echoing with the weight of a true king. "Strip her of her titles. She will be exiled to the Outer Rim, where the only voices she hears will be her own." "Lies." As the guards dragged a screaming, sobbing Hazel from the hall, the atmosphere shifted. The drama of the false lunar had ended, but the true romance was just beginning. Gengler turned to Cecilia, the distance between them feeling like 1,000 miles of regret. He didn't reach for her. He knew he hadn't earned that right yet. The morning sun didn't just rise over Blackmore. It felt like a new era breaking through stone. The great hall, once a place of Cecilia's deepest humiliation, had been transformed. The council's obsidian chairs were gone, replaced by a circular table that signaled a shift from tyranny to collaboration. Gengler stood at the foot of the dais. He had spent the night stripping the palace of every reminder of the council's groupthink regime. He looked tired, but for the first time in years, his eyes were clear, unclouded by drugs or false glamour. As Cecilia descended the stairs, the room fell into a profound, respectful hush. She wore a gown of midnight velvet, her throat unmarred and free, her presence so commanding that the air seemed to hum in her wake. Beside her walked her council of champions, Ashfong, the shield, Howard, the mind, and Gerald, the shadow. Even Quiraz stood at attention, his fist pressed to his heart. Gengler stepped forward, but he did not reach for her. He knelt, pressing his forehead to the floor in a gesture of absolute fealty. "I asked for a voice to lead an army," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't realize that a true queen doesn't need to shout to be followed. Cecilia, I was blind to the power of your silence. I don't ask for your forgiveness, I haven't earned it. Only to serve the kingdom you saved." Cecilia looked down at him. She didn't offer a hand to help him up, not yet. Instead, she used her resonance to project a single, clear thought into the minds of everyone present. It wasn't a scream, it was a warm, golden melody of unity. "A kingdom is not a song sung by one," her thought echoed, clear as a bell. "It is a symphony of many. We are strong not because we agree, but because we protect the right to be different. The wolves in the hall let out a collective howl, not of dominance, but of liberation. Cecilia took her seat, not on a throne above them, but at the head of the circle. She was the queen of silence, the woman who had turned a defect into a divine shield. The three rival alphas took their places around her, ensuring that Blackmore would never again fall into the trap of a single unchecked voice. Gengler remained at her side, a guardian who had learned that true love means listening to what isn't said. Hey, quick question, how are you feeling right now? To continue, please click the subscribe button, drop a comment, like, and share. Your support helps more than you know. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get back to the story. Thank you for witnessing the rise of the king's silent mate. Cecilia's journey reminds us that our greatest weaknesses are often our most untapped strengths, and that a leader who silences others eventually loses their own soul. In a world that never stops talking, may you find the power in your own silence. The council fell, the false lunar faded, and the queen found her resonance. Her power didn't just scream, it changed the world. We appreciate your time and your heart. Please remember to subscribe and join us for the next tale of fate and fury. Until then, stay authentic, stay strong, and keep listening. Good night.